John, thank you very much. It was a very inspiring and insightful story you told us there. Very, very good illustrations also of what we have as a general topic here, accountability, international law, and technology. And we are very privileged to have panelists here, Alexa Koenig and Marika Said-Assar. And they both have an impressive CV and record in this field of dealing with human rights, international law, and new technologies. So as a starter, I would like to ask them to respond to your story. Then we have some more remaining general questions to the extent that we haven't addressed them yet. And then later on, we'll open up to the floor. But first, a matter of order, a practical thing. I've been told that this is about accountability and technology. This is being webcasted live, so if you don't mind, and if you do mind, you have to adjust the situation slightly. So Alexa, can I start with you and ask you to comment or raise some questions that you would like to?
Well, thank you, first of all, for your comments and also for having me here. It's a big honor, of course, to be here and have a chance to further a lot of these issues that are so salient and so timely, and where I feel like we're really racing to play catch-up at this point from a law and a policy perspective. You gave us certainly plenty to respond to in the comments that you pulled together. One of the big things that really stood out to me was the concept of silos and how critical it was, particularly after the events of 9/11, to break down silos between law enforcement and other sectors of society. I think that's a trend that we need to push even further. A big piece of this, I think, is really going to be figuring out how we harness the different bodies of knowledge that are out there in society more generally. And just to give an example, one of the things that we're experimenting with on the UC Berkeley campus is we have a human rights investigations lab that we're trying to use to break down the silos among disciplines on campus and pull together teams of students who work in computer sciences, with people who are working on law and policy issues, with investigative journalists, with people who really understand the cultural complexities of a lot of the areas in which we're seeing conflict today. And we right now have 60 students working together that represent 25 different disciplines. Among them, they have 18 different languages. And the idea is, can we pull together sort of rapid response teams as conflicts erupt or as information is shared from the field so that they can be learning from each other about the methods at their disposal and creating more systematic and creative solutions to some of the challenges that we're facing. So I do think another piece of the breaking down of silos is not only between government and private corporations, but thinking how we can better tap into and harness the institutions we have at our disposal, leverage the incredible wealth of talent and creativity on college campuses, and then also think back from a temporal perspective even earlier. Another thing that you mentioned that I think was so important was thinking through the temporal chain of relationships and responsibility. So you mentioned that accountability comes too late. We can't just rely on the legal accountability piece to solve a lot of our law and policy challenges, but we need to think how to prevent these issues in the first outset. And you also spoke about the weaponizing of people. I think if we turn that on its head and we think through how we can reach earlier down our own chain of responsibility and how we can build a citizenry who is much more digitally literate than the one that we have today, who really thinks critically and creatively about how decision-making happens. Amnesty has been piloting this really exciting project called their Digital Verification Corps, where they're basically trying to link students on different college campuses to look at photos, social media posts that are erupting from conflict areas and teach students how to analyze them, how to debunk them, how to think through critically, how to address them. I think if we have a population that is trained in those skills from the outset, and I mean starting back in preschool, we're going to have a very different way of approaching this new world that we found ourselves in about how we communicate. The piece around facts versus emotion, I think, was really critical that you raised as well. So you talked about how there were social media tools that were put together that showed people handing out Nutella or cotton candy. I think better understanding and thinking through how people engage in decision-making about what to do, whether it is to engage in terrorist activity, who it is that you're going to support from a political or policy perspective, has also been somewhat neglected. And those are insights that I think we can really glean from the sociological sector and other potential partners. One big example that I always try and grapple with is on decision-making, there's sort of two strains of populations that have been identified. One is people make decisions based on what they see as the moral rationale of the underlying substance of a phenomenon. Another is that people make moral decisions based on sort of the being law-abiding citizens and following people in positions of authority. So I think when we can basically harness those two different ways of thinking, we're going to come up with policy messaging that becomes much more powerful than it would otherwise. And one quick example from that is I like to use the example of whether you put your child in a car seat and why you would actually go about doing that. Well, some people do it because they think morally that's the best way to keep their child safe. So it's a much more substantive perspective. Others do it because it's the law, and they know that they'll be penalized if they don't do that. So really creating kind of tools and technologies that think through how people make decisions around those two different frames, I think could be quite helpful. The data sharing piece. I think the need for thinking through data flows is so incredibly important. One of the hats that I've been wearing is to help administer the Tech Advisory Board for the International Criminal Court, and talking with major tech companies about how can we facilitate access to information that will ultimately link the highest level human rights abusers, war crimes perpetrators, to the bottom level people on the ground who are committing the rapes and murders. Well, a big part of that is tapping into social media and the ways that people are communicating today. The challenge, of course, is that when we meet with the major tech companies, they say we'll go through legal process. The problem is that there are several barriers to going through that legal process, one of which is the International Criminal Court is a new kind of institution, and the kind of institution that we might see increasingly on the global stage, where you're looking at an organization that's not tied to a particular state, but to a particular function. So they can't necessarily use the same MLAT treaty process, for example, that would be used by a state government. What are the different ways that we can figure out how to create new systems of information sharing that ultimately facilitate that process? Two final points. Transparency is such a big part of all of this. I think the more that we can be designing policies and technologies that are transparent, the better off we'll be. I've said this, and to some extent I'm joking, but to some extent I'm not. I almost feel like we need a Google Translate at this point for basic algorithms, so that people, or at least better training for people in society around how to think through, how to design algorithms for access to information, but also to better understand what they're doing. It's going to be such a big piece of how we move forward and how we can actually make smart calls about next steps. Transparency is such a big part of what government relies on in order to have trust from people, much like those of us who are working in the human rights space. And I think the only way we ultimately engender transparency or trust is by actually pushing forward with transparency. Last, I think that listening to you speak, one of the things that really jumped out to me is also more creative thinking needed about how we not only combat tech challenges today with more technology, but how we think through low-tech solutions to these high-tech challenges and even no-tech solutions to these high-tech challenges. I think so much of our focus right now is on the shiny object of how we deal with stronger encryption and new tools to act, but it's a race to the bottom in some ways, and sometimes it's a race to the top. But just using very basic examples of the experimentation that's happened with, how do we knock a drone out of the sky? Do we do it by jamming a GPS signal, or do we train hawks to knock them out? Do we demine a particular war zone by creating new technologies to locate these mines, or do we train rats to actually sniff them out and help us locate them? Do we ultimately figure out better encryption practices, or do we actually figure out how we take things offline and actually not use technological tools, and when is that most appropriate? So I think there's a lot of experimentation and thinking we can do on that. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And that is quite a list of points, and rightly so, because the lecture raised a lot of points. Are there some points that you would like to, off the cuff, immediately? I've taken some notes, but want to reply to?
Maybe. I think there were many good points made. A couple. One is, I fully agree on the cross-disciplinary approach. And so in government, I was talking about the National Security Division and its creation. Prior to that, it had been 4 different sets of lawyers reporting through 4 different chains. So it was those who did the prosecutions reported through one chain, those who did the intelligence authorities and oversaw compliance with the intelligence collection laws were through a second chain. A third chain were the lawyers who did the regulatory work to review national security threats like investments through the Committee on Foreign Investment inside the United States. and then another chain who did the cyber. So putting them together and allowing that expertise, and that's just in one field of the legal perspective. I can't imagine how it was done before, having inherited it after we had done that cross-disciplinary approach. And as I was saying, in terms of that meeting that was new for us, but when it came to changing the way people, essentially hardening your populace so that they have critical skills to not be prey to this type of propaganda technique, that's exactly why we were meeting with these experts, where I wouldn't, if you had predicted when I joined the Department of Justice in the late 90s that I'd ever, wearing my prosecutor hat, be meeting with Madison Avenue advertisers, Hollywood directors, internet service providers, and human rights groups, I would never have predicted it, but that was why. And partly what we're saying is we can't, this is not a problem we can solve. We need to continue to bring criminal cases against terrorists at this rate until we have a better solution, but success is not locking up 21 and unders. Success would be figuring out a way that, and it used to be our long-held assumption that you couldn't get someone to go from an idea to a violent act without meeting them in the real world. That's clearly changed as this group, in so many other ways as well, forms really trusted friendships entirely online and through social media. So how do you change that dynamic? If any message coming from the government, and I'm still wearing suits even though I'm out, but is not going to be effective with the disaffected 21-year-old set and underset. So how can you incentivize, educate people in the private sector writ broad, whether it's human rights community, advertising, et cetera, to see what the challenge is and then apply their same creativity that they're doing day in, day out in other fields to whole new approaches that we would never think of. I can assure you I never used the term micro-targeting of a demographic for advertising purposes until we did this type of meeting. Mm-hmm. So I think you raise some very vital points.
So Alexa mentioned the experiment that is going on at Berkeley of bringing those people from different disciplinary perspectives together to tackle those hard problems. Have you come across other examples of this? I mean, you described your discovery as, finding out the hard way and more or less a piecemeal engineering, all your cases where this works, this doesn't work. Have you seen examples of where people are doing this systematically, pursuing this, building a research agenda to educate the next generation of academics and entrepreneurs that have that under their belt?
I don't know that I have I've seen it in particular projects. I'm going to use a government phrase and then correct it. So we called it countering violent extremists, and it led certain groups to work. But the first thing we heard when we actually met with people who were expert was, that's a terrible name because you will never win something that has to do with countering. You need to instead have something that they're for. Nevertheless, the name is stuck. So, but I think in that arena that I've seen it, and now that I think the Belfer Center at Harvard is trying a similar approach, but I look forward to hearing from others as to what they think works in this space.
We'll get to that. There are a couple of points that I would first like to, and then we'll go to Malika. And another point that was raised is the issue of transparency and algorithms, and the new European data protection regulation will require this explanation or explainability of what is happening under the hood, let's say, the literally under the hood in the case of the Volkswagen software, etc. It's not obvious from the outside what's going on, and if it's starting to affect people in a serious way, we should be able to explain what is, and the relationship with trust, of course. I mean, if we cannot do that, and you haven't mentioned trust, could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, and actually you raised a second. We'll start with the second first and then come back. Your last point was about how we shouldn't think necessarily of a tech solution to tech problems. And I mentioned one version of that, which was the critical thinking, but I said somewhat flippantly in the remarks about how the Bowman Dam attack wouldn't have been successful if they had chosen to execute that authority because the dam was down for maintenance. It is also true that the Russian-affiliated actor attacks on the Ukrainian power grid were not as effective as they could have been, in part because that power grid was 30-some years out of date. And they had the operators knew how to operate it manually because they hadn't completely switched to a digitally operated system. That actually caused it to be resilient in a way that you then see with our electoral system. I think you've heard people talk about the fact that one of the reasons why, even though they may have attempted it, people had great confidence that on scale, the actual votes, although there was other mischief, weren't affected. Well, the U.S. system is a complicated hodgepodge of thousands of state and local systems, some of which are digitally connected, some aren't, which makes it incredibly hard to impact on scale. In none of those cases was that obsolescence designed with security in mind, but I do think now that we're thinking about, which we didn't do, is we put a lot of these systems online. If you start thinking and measuring risk on the front end, making choices, which are, here are the benefits, but here's a realistic appraisal of the risks, that a new way of thinking will be, there's certain things that just shouldn't be connected to the internet. And similarly, there may be certain information that you don't want to have online. Or if you do, you want to have segmented it and encrypted it or use other easily available tools now that are inefficient. But if you've done an adequate trade-off on risk, you may decide is worth the inefficiency, which would be a different way of thinking. On the transparency and trust, I think I was talking about transparency in a way that doesn't get discussed as much, but it's vital, which is we weren't transparent about we weren't doing a very good job of talking about what the threats are, what the intelligence was that we were seeing. And that inability to talk about it publicly then helped feed the continual discounting of risk, I think, in some of these areas that then leads to new systems that continue to be vulnerable. And that was one of the cycles we were trying to break by having a new approach of bringing things into the light using some existing tools like the criminal justice system, where you have a means, make public charges, you have a system where you can adjudicate it rather than treating it as an intelligence problem. I think transparency in different ways is important with each of the authorities. Certainly in any democratic country, you cannot do the job that you're expected to do to protect your citizenry without their trust. Yep. And ultimately, and it's particularly true when you're dealing with challenges that are, in the case of terrorism, where you need, the way we were able to resolve most cases, and the sort of the message you're getting out is somebody spotted, like, here's a troubled individual, it looks like they're moving towards violence. If we intervene early, it may never hit the criminal justice system, because they never go from idea to violence. You can't do that if people don't trust what happens if you make a referral or if you seek help outside your community.
So would you say that that's one of the major challenges ahead is of designing those new institutions and intelligence agencies and their protocols and procedures in such a way that we can strike a balance between, let's say, protecting privacy and fundamental rights, and on the other hand, efficaciousness or effectiveness in fighting crime fighting and fighting terrorism?
Yeah, and I think they're less sometimes object to, although I know sometimes it's about to treating it as like they're two different things or a balance. Often the privacy that you're protecting maybe because someone, right now, the greatest threat to our privacy online, I don't think here or in Europe is from the government. It's from the variety of criminal groups that are taking and selling your information on a very effective black market, and nation states that don't share values that target you because of what you think or say for human rights violations, both of which are actively using. So in many respects, having a rule of law way to do that effectively, I think, can accomplish both, and they marry up. The other thing I'm finding when I'm outside, and curious of others' thoughts, but it is also, if we had a system of carrots and sticks designed to encourage people to share information, we don't have that rightly calibrated right now. So even when there's trust, say, of law enforcement to share information, there's great uncertainty in one state. There's great uncertainty as to whether or not they're violating the laws, regs, or rules of another state in which they're operating. And then there's uncertainty even within that state of what's going to happen to me on the regulatory side. Am I going to now get hammered for having failed to keep the information safe, either for privacy or other reasons? And you want to incentivize both, but I don't think we have it right now. And it's great when you're a lawyer on the outside because it's an area of massive confusion and conflicts of law. So if you want full employment for lawyers, this is a good regime. But I don't think that for policy purposes, it's great. And the answers we give are often, I don't know, or it depends, or here's the hedge, and or you have to make a choice. Yeah. If you cooperate in this regime, you're violating the laws of the other regime. That's not ideal.
Yeah. That was interesting to see how you kind of mentioned and analyzed these, where you talked about the FBI and the door and kind of these setups or arrangements. These are kind of designs of how you structure your particular situation to let information pass through, or the relationship between government and companies in the case of protecting people. Good. There are some other questions I would like to come back to later, but first I would like to ask Malika to react to Joel's words.
So I'm going to take this in a very different direction.
Sure.
And I think what you shared was a narrative of how having the challenge to borders, moving into, if the 20th century in many ways was a century of the creation and entrenchment of walls and borders, certainly the 21st century, right, is a narrative around surmounting and collapsing and dismantling walls and borders, and the ways in which we are in this new digital reality of borders being collapsed and the implications of that around national security, around shared data. All of that is there. That is a narrative that is powerful, that challenges us in terms of law and policy. But from a human rights perspective, I want to tell another story that stands alongside what you've shared. And that's the story of what human rights looks like in a new digital context and the intersection of human rights and the advancement of tech. And I think about this in a very different and real way. I think about this in terms of the story of Mamie Till. Mamie Till was the mother of Emmett Till. In 1954, Emmett Till was a 14-year-old African-American boy who was visiting family down south and ostensibly whistled at a white woman. And that night, he was pulled out of the bed he shared with his family. He was beaten, lynched, and thrown into the water. And his body was retrieved. And Mamie Till said, "I want the world to know what happened to my boy." And so she insisted that he have an open casket and that the pictures of his mutilated body would be photographed and then shared with the world. And that was the beginning of the civil rights movement. That there were conversations that civil rights marchers had years later talking about. It was the image of Emmett Till in the casket that led me to fight for equality. So I think about Mamie Till when I think about the power of tech around human rights abuses. Because every human rights abuse, every war crime, every rape, every act of abuse so often is in the context of the walls and the isolation and the silence. And so the ways in which tech allows us to surmount the isolation and the silence that always protects and perpetuates human rights violations. And the most powerful example of this is one within this country that we see has happened in the last couple of years. And that's police brutality. The conversation that we are having around police brutality now is a very different conversation than a decade ago. A decade ago, the conversation around police brutality mostly happened in Black and brown communities. But as a result of the smartphones that we have and the ways that we can capture video of a police beating, of a man being choked in Staten Island by police, the ways that that video has been captured and then shared on global platforms like YouTube has completely changed our conversation around the human rights abuses that happen within law enforcement. It has become a popular square conversation. And that is because of the ways in which what has isolated us within our own country around race and culture, those walls were surmounted by the power of these technologies of a smartphone and global platforms. And I think about that time and again, whether it's the story of an individual activist in Uganda fighting for LGBT rights who is beaten, and that video is then shared on global platforms. So we as a global community bear witness to that human rights violation. And the space between the US and Uganda is collapsed, and a human rights violation is witnessed and rallied against. I really have come to believe as a human rights lawyer more and more that the more digitally connected we are, the less opportunity there is for wide-scale human rights abuses and genocide. And it is because of how we can collapse the walls and the spaces to be able to bear witness, to be able to disrupt the silence and the isolation that allows abuse and genocide to play out time and time again. I also have remarkable hope and hope that some of the conversation we have here in talking about this intersection between human rights and tech can also go to the opportunities to create technologies to be able to better hold accountable war crimes. So as you spoke about, the app of e-witness to atrocities, right, that allows anyone with a smartphone to be able to capture a human rights abuse. And then what plays out because of this app is that it's given time, the GPS locator verifies where it has played out, it is encrypted, it is shared at a data center that is part of the app, and then there's a panic button that can be pressed to dissolve all of the connection to the individual who has videoed that moment of abuse. I'm fascinated by the opportunities that we have to create a space between engineers and human rights defenders to create more of these kinds of technologies that can be used to go after war crimes. I mean, imagine if we had that during Bosnia. Imagine if we are able to hold Assad accountable for the war crimes in Syria. What we will have to be able to charge him with is so much more powerful because of tech than we ever had available to us in Bosnia. And so that is part of where I hope this conversation goes as well, because it's the other part of the conversation around the promise and the potential of how we actually can move human rights forward because of what's available to us as digital tools.
Great, thank you. John, would you like to respond to this?
No, I think there is great
Potential there, yeah.
Potential.
Yeah.
It's also, though, I think it's a mistake to assume that because we've had a change, and I think you would agree, actually, but the change in technology does not equal walls down, borders down, and a new world in which we're going to live in freer, safer regimes that are more protective of human rights. I think there was great excitement that was kind of occurring on its own as regimes fell, repressive regimes fell for a period of time in the Middle East, and people talked about a social media revolution in the way people were going to govern in the future. And that's not where the trend line went, unfortunately. And if you look now, and this is partly what I was addressing, is I think there's a move now towards the localization of data that makes it more difficult to share information and makes it easier for a repressive regime to abuse its own infrastructure in a way that's inconsistent with internationally held norms and principles. In order to prevent that from being the world, and we can't take for granted it's going to head in the other direction as technology improves. It's going to take a concerted effort to really articulate what our commonly held values are, and then the hard process of figuring out how to implement them in a way that if people don't feel safe and trust their government, you lose, I think, then, and it's not always right. I mean, the safety may not actually, they may be relatively safe, but fear, if people are driven by fear, then that does not tend towards regimes that are protective of human rights and civil liberties. And so we're simultaneously in a world where you can project abuses in a way you never can before and get people together, and where groups can exploit that to use the same. That's why I called it crowdsourcing of terrorism that's used for good. I met with as one of the most painful experiences in a career where I started prosecuting in homicides and rapes, but one of the most painful experiences was meeting with some of the families whose loved ones were taken hostage by the Islamic State in the Levant, and talking to them and recognizing certain failures we had in communicating them and helping them, but listening to their description of what it's like to see your son slowly beheaded, and knowing that the world is watching it. They're both opportunities are there with a powerful new set of technologies, and we need to figure out how to make sure that it attends more to the good than the bad.
Exactly right. I mean, you talked about that you'll use the weaponization of all these good technologies. You have a very striking example of how the digital technology can be used in the panic button, wanted to perform as we wanted to perform, but without all the drawbacks. Now, my question to all of you probably is, how do we bring this about? Who is our audience? Who are we addressing with this question? If we're all on the same page and we say, let's shape digital technology in such a way that that it does, and demonstrably so, does what we want it to do without the drawbacks, without the violations of human rights, without all of the kind of the risks and the threats that we introduce in addition. So who are we?
Maybe address some of it. I think as you so rightly pointed out, the way that we're using technology today is bringing forward voices and stories that we've needed to hear. What I'm concerned about is that in addition to getting access to these stories in really critical ways, there's an equality piece that we also have to grapple with internationally. So I think thinking through the proliferation of smartphones is an example of how that shifts whose voices we're hearing. Is a really important one, both from a gendered perspective and also a class perspective. I think there's a kind of a classic example where you saw one tech company created an app for recording sexual violence in conflict zones, but it was targeted and rolled out in a part of the world where really only the men had access. And if the woman was to actually get hold of her husband or brother or father's smartphone and download this app and actually use it, she was potentially revealing that she had in some way been violated, and that could have really dire consequences. So I think thinking through the ways technologies can have no impact, even when beautifully designed, or can have very negative impacts is something we've yet to fully dive into and explore. Using the great example of Eyewitness to Atrocity, which I think has been so brilliantly designed and really thought through the chain of custody piece of it, so we can think through how the survivors and the activists who are risking their lives every day to get information, whether it's domestic or internationally out of war zones, so that whatever they're gathering has as much potential evidentiary weight as possible, has been a huge part of the education process over the last 5 years. I think what we need to think through next are the distribution components of that, of how do we get this into the hands of the people who can use it most? What does that look like? And a lot of times that's adapting existing technologies and really understanding what technologies are already used on the ground to make them more secure and user-friendly. But then the other piece is on the opposite end. So I know one of the challenges is once you've gathered all this information and this incredibly rich data, who do you allow to have access to it? And I think that's a sticking point that we're at looking in terms of the human rights field right now. Do we need to create some kind of blind trust or an escrow system whereby the activists who are sharing the information have some degree of control and there's some degree of ability to decide who can have access to that information and protect their identities, because so often they are putting their lives at risk to share this in the first place? And then what are the policy considerations about who we give this information to, and what do we expect in terms of how they will use it and the transparency around that? And those are conversations that I think we're just beginning to have and really need to dive into more deeply.
So what do you think, what all of you think are the responsibilities, we haven't touched upon that yet, of IT industry, because we're using, these kind of gadgets that are produced not for these kind of human rights or kind of the common good, but preferably for the quarterly revenues, which is okay, of course, but it's something that we have to bear in mind. And the add up, or the adding all of these little gadgets and little kind of services and products up digital doesn't necessarily lead to a kind of a decent or the society that we want. What do you see? How do you conceive of the responsibility of IT industry in this?
Well, if I could begin, I mean, I am at Google, right, as a human rights lawyer,
that's the reason why
so that's the beginning. So I mean, how I have seen it in my role is really playing off of what you have surfaced, the importance of bringing human rights defenders into the room with engineers, right, so that these products are developed in a way that it doesn't just sound nice, it's not just some nice gadget and tricks, but that really the context in which the activists need to use the app is fully understood, and all the implications and challenges are fully unearthed between the activist and the engineer. So I think that that's a very powerful area that we need to be able to grow more, and is something that our companies are at a powerful place to do. I think the other piece for me is also in light of what you've discussed is emerging markets, right? So we have to be digitally connected, right? Folks who are in areas of the isolated rural parts of the Sudan, where there are human rights violations every day, have to be digitally connected in order to be able to hold accountable their abusers. And that's not our reality right now. There's a reason why we see more evidence of human rights abuses in Syria than what's happening in parts of Sudan and Somalia, right? So for me, there's a commitment in speaking to emerging markets, not simply for revenue and capital, but in order to be able to recognize that there's a human rights reason to do emerging markets. And as we do emerging markets and stay committed to that, we have a gendered consideration of how it's done as well. I think the other piece for me has been, and this is also around transparency, is that, look, this is the new concentration of wealth and power, right? That's what we are. And so the importance of being able to make sure that human rights defenders, that women's rights defenders understand that and understand the landscape of it and have access to it. So that has been very critical for me in this role, is to make sure that the women's rights organizations have contact and connection and dialogue with Google. And that the same is done in other areas of human rights defenders, that there is a way in which, in the same opportunities that we hold accountable civil society, the private sector, government, that kind of approach also has to happen in the context of tech.
Shifting companies now, Facebook, you talked about this this micro-targeting and this self-radicalization, which is basically a result, or in part, a result of the fact that that environment is designed or constructed in such a way that you have these feedback loops, and people kind of get locked up in filter bubbles and echo chambers. So their self-radicalization dynamic properties of that behavior are a result or in function of the structure of that environment. So no amount of bringing people together and having them sit around the table and dialogue about these things will change those very basic architectural principles that then will give rise to the problems that you will have to deal with. And so is that correct?
Well, but I mean, part of the, at Google, for instance, we have this whole counter-speech effort going on, right? So that when you see radical YouTube videos come up, also what comes up are other videos that point in the direction of the work around tolerance and inclusiveness that is happening in Muslim countries, in areas where there is extremism. And that came out of conversation and dialogue with human rights defenders, right?
So you would say there's a shift from, oh, this is all the market, but now they seem to realize what incredible influence these kind of top 5 IT industries have on the shaping of our society, or our future society, and they will take responsibility in proportion to their contribution. Is that? Do you see that kind of shift? Are you hopeful?
I'm hopeful. I certainly see it playing out at Google. I think both Facebook and Google around the fake news are recognizing the ways that we have
editorial
to address
responsibilities
this.
for
Exactly right. And how do we use an algorithmic response, but also how do we think through what our responsibility is here, because none of this is neutral.
Right, absolutely right. Yeah, we're not talking about shoelaces, but about the fundamental structure of a digital society.
That's right.
Are the same level of optimism with the other members of the panel? Or?
I think one of my biggest growing concerns is exactly as you mentioned, this growing concentration of power in the way that we're using these different digital technologies. So I think if we look at there really being 3 super companies that are emerging as having tremendous amount of control over our ability to engage in artificial intelligence and machine learning, to think through how we share information and what those information flows look like. That was power that was traditionally held in the hands mostly of government actors. And we've created an entire society that's built on thinking through what transparency tools we need for government. But we really haven't thought through this shift in the way that power is happening globally and what kind of transparencies, and I think getting to your carrots and sticks piece of this, what kinds of incentives need to be baked into this emerging global environment so that we do have a lot more transparency than we would have otherwise? How is that good for business and for corporate actors? And how is that then good for society as a whole? I think that's right.
John, would you like to respond to that, or should?
You've touched on some of the most challenging issues. I think it is definitely true that we were seeing the fragmenting of certain groups online, whereas instead of a way to be exposed to new ideas and new people that you'd have, and I always never liked the term self-radicalizing, because when we looked at it in most instances, it wasn't self-radicalizing. Instead, you'd end up in this echo chamber of hate, and that was true for the motivation of domestic terrorists, which we usually, define by those inspired by hatred of a particular ethnic group here or homegrown grievance. And it was true of international terrorists, those who were being deliberately targeted as part of a strategy by a terrorist group. And then you'd have often very young and influenceable, and sometimes those with other mental challenges end up in this echo chamber of hate where everything they saw would affirm. I think this is why people call it self-radicalized, some view that they had started to have. And so how you get into that sphere or echo chamber in a way that's consistent with the idea that you should have the right to choose who you're able to communicate with. And then secondly, and very difficult issue, is fake news. And that's not so new. For one case I didn't talk about, was Syrian Electronic Army case. This was a case where one version of fake news is they spoofed a terrorist attack on the White House, And because they caused fear and panic due to that terrorist attack, the stock market lost billions and billions of dollars. Fake news, before we were all using the term fake news. The terrorist use of just utterly false propaganda about what life was like in the Levant, along with made-up abuses carefully tailored about what those who opposed Islamic State were doing. We didn't use the phrase fake news for that either, but that was their incredibly effective recruiting tool. And now you have this nation state interference with an election where we've started to use the term fake news. But that, and I'm curious from those in the human rights, it's very challenging to then, so who's made the arbiter of what's real and what's fake? And because the regimes have long said, for instance, that a human rights activist, that films in an area of abuse, that it just didn't happen. You're hearing it right now with the chemical weapons. It's fake. So is there a way to both call it for what it is, that we're seeing some regimes exploit and deliberately push fake news and take advantage of technical algorithms to push them, without having a drive to the bottom where people throw up their hands and say, I don't know what's real, so I'm not, I'm just going to believe essentially what confirms my already strongly held beliefs?
Because all of the things that you said apply equally to, outside of the domain of this terrorism and radicalization, but also kind of more broadly kind of to society and citizens at large, because we're all the victims in these kind of presidential elections or in the Brexit. We know that actually Cambridge Analytica, we know that the people who are working on AI and big data have played a very important role in all of that. So that seems to be a really important issue. Yeah, I think we need to open up to the audience. So there are a number of microphones available. So I saw someone in the back, the lady there with the.
Hi there. My name's Rebecca McKinnon. I direct a project at New America called Ranking Digital Rights. I'm also on the board of the Committee to Protect Journalists and co-founder of a citizen media network called Global Voices. I want to raise an issue that hasn't been brought up directly yet, which has to do with an increasing tendency in Europe in particular, but I think also a desire by other legislatures elsewhere to hold internet companies liable, both for extremist speech, efforts at recruitment, and so on. And there's proposed legislation in Germany right now that would require internet companies basically to pre-censor anything that's deemed illegal, thereby basically holding the company responsible for making the legal judgment rather than a court or a government official, which raises a lot of accountability and transparency questions. There's also been a tendency in many places, this company as well as in Europe, to call for a weakening of encryption, to call for requirements for backdoors for law enforcement and other government officials, which has caused great concern among human rights communities and investigative journalists and others about the potential real negative consequences for human rights over the long term globally if democracies lead the way in weakening encryption. And so I'd love if the panelists could comment on some of these things. Thank you.
Who would like to respond to that?
I can begin that you're right to raise all those issues, that I think that especially the latter is a real challenge and affront to human rights protections to weaken encryption. And I know that we are very unsettled by what's playing out. And I think also in terms of, within the US, we have Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which allows for intermediary liability protections. And it is really the backbone of the internet. And I have very real concerns around what happens when you begin to hold tech companies accountable for third-party content. At the same time, I feel that we are, within Google, and I think Google's not alone in this, really struggling with this, this tension and dance between freedom of expression, right, and the normalization of hatred, right? And there are no clear answers around how to pivot, but it is a tension that we have to deal with every single day, to be able to not be engaged in censorship, and at the same time, not allow for a digital landscape in which extremism and hatred are normalized. And just to add, and I just want to make sure that we recognize that this is not just about terrorists and international extremists. It's also about within this country as well, and white supremacist organizations, and the same type of tension that we are in the middle of with white supremacist organizations too, that it is not simply about terrorists and foreign nationals.
There's a question here in the front side there.
Hi, Dan Shefford. Before asking my question, I'd just like to comment on what you said. I happen to be working with the German Ministry of Justice on the fake news bill that you referred to. And there is no such obligation in that bill of a pre-screening or monitoring. It all works on notice takedown. Pre-screening and monitoring would be a violation of the Saban Netlock case, European Court of Justice. So there is no such thing. And please, everybody, don't believe it's not the case. Now, the question I would like to ask you is, in terms of accountability of the private sector, and it's been mentioned already that maybe encryption may pose a problem or not. You mentioned the e-service and e-evidence problems. You mentioned the mutual assistance system that doesn't work. And how do you see, there are very specific fact cases like San Bernardino and so on. What is the position what was the position when you had the position you had on the cooperation with the private sector on breaking encryption when needed for law enforcement purposes?
And I think that's there's a couple different thoughts. One is we need to recognize there's a real problem that not just law enforcement in one particular country, like the United States, is facing, but law enforcement and national security agencies in every country around the world. And it's a problem that's driven by exploitation of a new form of instantaneous communication that does much good. So it doesn't mean the technology is bad. It has great potential, but it is an issue that is going to require a legal policy solution. And I worry if we take the approach of that either it's not a real problem, it's something that's being made up, or that it's one where the value of free instantaneous communication trumps all other values, that won't actually lead to a world of freer communication and less regulation, but it will continue the speed with which we're moving towards a trend where data localization is required by law if you're going to provide your service in a country, because at the end of the day, whether it's my German counterparts, French, United Kingdom, Belgium, as each faces this same issue, not only are they incredibly frustrated, it is both an issue of frustration. In the U.S., they're primarily, to date, and this will change, but U.S. companies where you're having the debate. In Germany, it's a U.S. company causing the problem for local law enforcement. There's even less tolerance for the answer of, we have no solution. So what is, to define the problem crisply or in San Bernardino, it's, for years we've worked a constitutional system out where if you're able to meet a certain predicate under the law, so probable cause, you go to a neutral, detached magistrate, a judge, to swear out a search warrant. And then when you go to effectuate the search warrant, you have the technical means to do it because it's something like, and it's a very invasive technique, which is why it's subject to so many privacy protections that are enshrined in our Constitution, is the idea that you can do it, but that it also requires these protection. And that's a problem as old as the Fourth Amendment. So it includes searching through someone's privacy and possessions. As we've had the new technology, and not by, I think, by original design, you have the prospect of a sphere where your phone is outside the boundaries of law enforcement process for local enforcement, or your communications, unlike how they are with the telephone, are outside the bounds of law enforcement, no matter how great the need and how high the predicate. And that's the issue that I think people are struggling with, and I don't think it has an easy answer. That said, I tend to have some optimism. If we recognize that as the problem we're trying to solve, I tend to think that you can innovate your way both technically towards it, so the way that you maximize the security of the information, continue to make the private sector party the protector of that information, and only allow it through targeted, approved law enforcement means. If we agreed that was the world we wanted to live in, that we could design our way towards it. And I think that's what you heard President Obama articulate at South by Southwest. There is another world that says in both directions, either we want more, we think we should always have more access to the information in that world, or we think there should be a completely outside of state reach, no matter how great the need or what the law enforcement processes, it should just never be reachable. I think even if you have that view, that will actually result in something less like that world than you desire as states react.
Some more questions here, over there.
Hello, my name is Camila. My question is going back to the idea that now with technology, we are able to see human rights abuses that were previously just known within the communities. However, what we see now is that still a lot of the narrative is shaped by media regarding certain news. So it's like the man who came to New York City, the terrorist who came to New York City to stab any black man that he saw because he was upset about black men having relationships with white women. And yet, we saw the media talk about it as this well-dressed man came and stabbed someone instead of labeling him as a terrorist. And, and we see some countries get flags on Facebook and others don't. So we have all this information accessible to us. However, the narrative is still very, within the US, very white-centric. Mm-hmm. Do you think the narrative is going to change on its own regarding this? Or is there anything that could be done to change it from any perspective?
I mean, what I find really interesting and hopeful is that the narrative is not owned by one space anymore, right? So the narrative is also produced and reproduced on Twitter, right? The narrative is also owned and shaped by YouTube creators that often, our top YouTube creators get more hits and have more subscribers than the main news media stations, right? CNN can't rival what our top YouTube creators get in terms of the number of eyes on them. So that to me is what's fascinating, is that whereas before there was one concentration of power and authority that owned the narrative, and often that authority was not representative of this country or globally, that has powerfully shifted, and I think is only going to be recreated and reframed even more moving forward.
I had two questions over here, the gentleman over there and the gentleman there. Yeah.
Lauren Hershey, I was in the antitrust division back in the 1980s. I was involved in the breakup of AT&T. I was invited to come over here as a guest scholar, so I have a request of you. That was in 1986-87. This is too rich. I prefer to be an optimist, but you're chilling me and charming me at the same time. Will you come back as a foursome and represent to us periodically? And that would go all the way through 2020. Thank you very much.
We'll have a discussion about that over lunch, but it's a very interesting suggestion. And with this, we have to draw this penalty. I'm very sorry. I'm being nudged here from the. Yeah. Oh, can we do one more question? One more question. Yes. Yeah, you're lucky. Yeah.
Hi, Tim Rideout, non-resident fellow at GMF and part-time curmudgeon. I'm concerned that the tech companies are sort of claiming this sort of self-righteous, the defenders, and many of them are doing good work. And I agree with Malika that Bringing attention to these previously unheard voices and drawing attention is a very good thing. But for example, there was just this deregulation of privacy rights that the Trump administration signed, and this is going to be a boon for ISPs, advertisers, tech companies, and they're selling people's information. I've already read something in the Brazilian press that's questioning whether this is going to run afoul of their 2014 internet governance legislation, which is very protective of Brazilian citizens and their rights. So what about when tech companies are infringing upon the rights of citizens? Thanks.
A good question, yeah.
And I just want to be clear that from Google's perspective, we were not supportive of that and do not see that as a boon in any way.
Yeah. It will also be a serious problem for the privacy shield and the carefully negotiated kind of level playing field in data protection regimes between Europe and the US, of course, and that will have a huge impact. So thank you very much for that. I think from the discussion, it is clear that we're up against huge challenges. We'll have to draw upon different disciplines and different bodies of knowledge and bring those people effectively together to work on designs that are both comprehensive, that are systems designs, that involve people and software and hardware and institutions and governance and regulations and protocols and all of that, and the whole kit and caboodle needs to be designed. That is the thing that we refer to as value-sensitive design. So I thank you very much for your contribution to the panel, the wonderful discussions, generous sharing of your ideas, and John, of course, for a wonderful, really beautiful lecture. Thank you very much. And with that, I hand over to... No, we're done. Oh, actually. So then, yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.